The year is 2180. Humanity lives underground, and if you step outside, machines will hunt you down. But nobody remembers exactly how we got here. So today, I'm going to walk you through every single event that led to the complete collapse of human civilization. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. The world before Earth in the early 22nd century was nothing like you'd imagine from old science fiction. We didn't have flying cars or teleportation devices or cities floating in the clouds. What we had was something far more subtle and far more dangerous, a world that had pushed itself to the absolute brink of sustainability and was held together by technology that most people didn't understand and couldn't control. The global population had reached 15 billion people, and every single one of them needed food, water, energy, and hope. The problem was that Earth could barely provide the first three, and the fourth had become a luxury reserved for those who could afford it. Climate change wasn't some distant threat anymore. It was the daily reality. Coastal cities had been partially submerged for decades, and massive engineering projects kept the water at bay with varying degrees of success. The Amazon rainforest was gone, replaced by a combination of agricultural zones and desert. The Arctic ice had melted completely, opening up new shipping routes but also releasing methane deposits that accelerated warming even further. Heat waves that killed thousands were now regular summer occurrences in what used to be temperate zones. People adapted because they had no choice, but adaptation has limits. The wealthy had retreated into climate-controlled arcologies, massive self-contained cities that regulated their own weather and filtered their own air. These structures dominated the skylines of what remained of major metropolitan areas, towering monuments to human ingenuity and inequality in equal measure. Inside them, life continued much as it always had for the privileged. Outside, in the sprawl, billions struggled through each day. The middle class had effectively ceased to exist as an economic category. You were either inside the walls or outside them, either connected to the network of power and resources that kept the arcologies running, or left to fend for yourself in the increasingly hostile environment. Governments still existed in name, but their power had been hollowed out over decades. The real authority belonged to the mega corporations that controlled the infrastructure, the agricultural zones, the water purification systems, the energy grids. They had names you'd recognize if you studied the history: Nakamoto Dynamics, Volkov Industries, the Terran Resource Consortium, names that appeared on everything from food packaging to military contracts. These entities had effectively become nation-states unto themselves, complete with private armies, diplomatic corps, and territories that spanned continents. The old national borders still appeared on maps, but they meant less with each passing year. What mattered was who controlled the resources in your region and whether you had value to them as a worker, a consumer, or a problem to be managed. The resource crisis. By 2140, the resource situation had become critical in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. Water was the most obvious crisis, fresh water specifically. The aquifers that had supplied humanity for thousands of years were depleted or contaminated. Rivers ran dry for parts of the year. The ocean desalination plants that were supposed to solve everything required enormous amounts of energy to operate, and energy itself was becoming scarce. Fossil fuels were nearly exhausted, not because we'd run out completely, but because extracting what remained required more energy than the fuel provided. Nuclear power had expanded dramatically, but uranium wasn't infinite either, and the spent fuel problem had never been truly solved, just postponed. Renewable energy covered some of the gap, but solar panels and wind turbines required rare earth elements, and those were running low too. The supply chains that kept civilization functioning were strained to the breaking point. A single disruption in one part of the world could cascade through the entire system, causing shortages and price spikes thousands of miles away. This had happened dozens of times, each incident a little worse than the last, each recovery a little slower. People had learned to hoard when they could afford to stockpile essentials against the next inevitable shortage. This behaviour only made the system more fragile. Food production was perhaps the most precarious element of all. Industrial agriculture had pushed yields to their theoretical maximum through genetic engineering, precision farming, and chemical inputs. But the topsoil was degraded, the pollinators were declining, and the monocultures were vulnerable to disease. Several times in the 2130s, crop failures in major agricultural regions had triggered famines that killed millions. The corporations responded by consolidating control further, arguing that only centralized management could prevent disasters. They weren't entirely wrong, but their solutions came with costs that were paid by people who had no say in the matter. Synthetic food production helped fill some gaps. Vat-grown proteins, algae farms, fungal cultivars designed to thrive in controlled environments. These technologies kept billions alive, but they required infrastructure, energy, and expertise. They also tasted terrible, which might seem like a minor complaint until you realize that for many people, food had become purely functional, stripped of culture and pleasure, and reduced to calories and nutrients consumed as efficiently as possible. The psychological toll of this transition was measurable in suicide rates and mental health statistics, though those numbers were often suppressed or manipulated by the entities that gathered them. The Exodus project, against this backdrop of scarcity and desperation, a group of billionaires and corporate leaders began discussing a radical solution: leaving Earth entirely. The idea had been floating around in various forms for over a century, but technology had finally caught up with ambition. The Exodus project, as it came to be known, was announced publicly in 2145 with great fanfare and optimism. According to the official messaging, it was humanity's backup plan, an insurance policy against extinction, a way to spread our species across the solar system and eventually beyond. Resources would be pooled, the best minds would collaborate, and within 2 decades, ships would launch, carrying the first wave of colonists to establish permanent settlements on Mars, the moons of Jupiter, and eventually other star systems. The reality behind the public relations was considerably less noble. The Exodus project was exclusive from the beginning. Participation required either extraordinary wealth or skills deemed essential to building a spacefaring civilization. Engineers, scientists, doctors, pilots, these people received invitations. So did the billionaires who funded the project, their families, their friends, their business associates. Applications were accepted from the general public, supposedly to maintain the pretense of openness, but the selection criteria were designed to exclude almost everyone. You needed perfect health, multiple advanced degrees, psychological evaluations, and proof that you could contribute to the mission in specific ways. You also needed to afford the transportation fee, which started at 10 million credits and increased annually. When critics pointed out that this was simply the rich abandoning Earth, the Exodus leadership responded with carefully crafted statements about merit and capability. They claimed the selection process was entirely objective, based on algorithms and assessment protocols that eliminated human bias. They published statistics showing diversity in their selection of crew members, carefully highlighting the handful of people from modest backgrounds who'd made it through. What they didn't publicize was that those exceptional individuals were often taken without their families, separated from their communities, and dropped into an environment where they were perpetually reminded of their outsider status. The construction of the Exodus fleet proceeded rapidly, consuming resources on a scale that would have been unimaginable for any government project. Massive orbital shipyards were established at the Lagrange points. Automated mining operations stripped asteroids for raw materials. The factories ran constantly, producing hull sections and life support systems and engines that could sustain human crews across interplanetary distances. All of this required energy, and energy required infrastructure on Earth. The corporations diverted power from civilian grids to support their orbital operations, causing rolling blackouts in cities that had never experienced them before. When people complained, they were told it was temporary, a sacrifice necessary for the future of humanity. The sacrifice fell disproportionately on those who would never benefit from it. Rising tensions. The years between 2145 and 2155 saw social tensions escalate to levels not experienced since the collapse of the Old World Order. The Exodus Project became a lightning rod for every grievance, every inequality, every broken promise. Mass protests erupted in cities across the planet, with millions taking to the streets to demand that the resources being poured into space colonization be redirected to solving problems on Earth. The response from authorities was predictable: riot police, surveillance drones, mass arrests, and increasingly lethal force deployed against demonstrators. Several protests turned into riots, and several riots turned into massacres. The most infamous was the Jakarta incident in 2151, where security forces opened fire on a crowd of protesters who had surrounded a corporate headquarters, killing over 3,000 people in a single afternoon. The footage leaked despite the corporation's best efforts to suppress it, and the images of bodies being bulldozed into mass graves became a rallying point for resistance movements worldwide. Those movements grew more organised and more radical with each passing month. Eco-terrorist groups sabotaged mining operations and destroyed corporate facilities. Hacker collectives penetrated secured networks and released confidential documents showing the true extent of resource extraction and environmental damage. Armed militias declared certain territories independent from corporate control and fought running battles with private security forces. The old national governments, weakened and cash-strapped, often found themselves unable or unwilling to intervene. Some governments secretly supported the resistance movements, providing intelligence or sanctuary to wanted fugitives. Others collaborated fully with the corporations, essentially becoming enforcement arms for private interests. The distinction between public and private authority had blurred to the point of meaninglessness in many regions. If a corporation owned the land, the water, the power grid, and the food supply, what did it matter what flag flew over the region or what legal code was theoretically in effect? The Exodus leadership watched these developments with increasing alarm and responded by accelerating their timeline. The original plan had called for a phased departure over several decades, but that was revised to get the first ships launched within 10 years. They would leave behind a planet in chaos, but that was acceptable as long as they got out. Internal documents leaked from the project show that they understood perfectly well they were abandoning Earth, not saving it. One memo from a senior administrator stated it explicitly: once we achieve orbit and establish self-sufficiency, Earth becomes irrelevant to our survival. We can afford to cut all ties if necessary. That coldness, that calculation, tells you everything you need to know about the people who left. The collapse begins. The precise beginning of what we now call the collapse is difficult to pinpoint because it wasn't a single event, but a cascade of failures that fed into each other. Most historians mark it as starting in 2157, when the Indian subcontinent experienced simultaneous crop failures across its major agricultural regions. A new fungal pathogen, later determined to be a mutated strain that had evolved resistance to all known treatments, swept through wheat, rice and cornfields, destroying yields that were supposed to feed 2 billion people. Famine followed within months, mass starvation on a scale not seen in centuries. The Indian government appealed for international aid, but the response was minimal. The major powers were dealing with their own crises. The North American Union was experiencing severe droughts and wildfires that consumed entire states. The European Federation was managing a refugee crisis as Mediterranean regions became uninhabitable due to heat and water scarcity. China was grappling with the collapse of its agricultural communes and widespread civil unrest. Nobody had surplus food to spare, and even if they did, the logistics of transportation and distribution were breaking down. Ships sat in ports because there wasn't fuel to run them. Planes were grounded for the same reason. Roads that would have carried aid convoys were controlled by militias or warlords, who demanded payment or simply took what they wanted. The famine in India triggered a mass migration as hundreds of millions of people attempted to flee to regions where food might still be available. This movement of people overwhelmed every system it touched. Borders were closed, but desperate people don't respect borders. They walk through minefields, they swim across rivers, they die in the thousands, and the survivors keep moving because staying means certain death. The nations receiving these refugees militarized their responses. Walls went up, guard towers, automated defense systems. Shoot-on-sight orders were issued and enforced. The death toll from this migration crisis alone is estimated at over 300 million people, though accurate counting was impossible under the circumstances. The Exodus fleet watched all of this from orbit, literally watching through their sensors and cameras as the planet below descended into chaos. They could have helped. They had resources, technology, ships that could have delivered aid or evacuated people. They chose not to intervene. Later, when survivors asked them about this decision, they claimed interference would have been pointless, that Earth's problems were too far gone to fix, that saving a few million people would have just prolonged the suffering. Perhaps they believed that. Perhaps they were simply rationalizing their selfishness. Either way, they did nothing while billions died. Infrastructure breakdown. As the famine and migration crisis unfolded, the global infrastructure that supported modern civilization began failing in earnest. Power grids went down first because they required constant maintenance and fuel supplies that were no longer reliable. A grid failure in one region could cascade into neighboring regions within hours, as systems automatically shut down to prevent damage. By 2158, most of the planet experienced intermittent power at best. The areas that maintained electricity were either corporate-controlled zones with their own generation capacity, or regions that had never been connected to the main grids in the first place. For billions of people accustomed to technology that required constant power, this was devastating. Communication networks collapsed next because they depended on power and physical infrastructure that was being destroyed. Cell towers were stripped for salvageable materials by desperate people. Fiber optic cables were cut to extract the copper. Satellites in orbit continued broadcasting, but there were fewer and fewer ground stations capable of receiving their signals. The internet, which had been humanity's nervous system for over a century, fragmented into isolated networks that couldn't communicate with each other. Information became local again, rumour and speculation filling the gaps left by the absence of reliable news. This breakdown in communications made coordination impossible. Governments couldn't talk to their regional administrators. Corporations lost contact with their facilities. Families were separated with no way to find each other. The psychological impact of this sudden isolation was profound. People had lived their entire lives connected to a global network, always able to reach out to anyone anywhere, and suddenly that capability was gone. Water systems failed because they required pumps that needed power, and treatment facilities that needed chemicals, and staff who increasingly didn't show up for work. Rivers and lakes were contaminated with industrial runoff and human waste. People drank from whatever sources they could find and died from cholera, dysentery, typhoid. Diseases that had been nearly eradicated returned with a vengeance. Medical systems collapsed under the weight of so many sick and injured. Hospitals ran out of supplies, their staffs fled or died, their equipment failed without power to run it. The pharmaceutical supply chains that had produced medications dissolved as factories shut down and distribution networks evaporated. People with chronic conditions found themselves without the treatments that kept them alive. Diabetics without insulin, people with heart conditions without their medications, cancer patients without chemotherapy. They died by the millions, their deaths barely noticed in the larger catastrophe. Cities became death traps. Dense populations without infrastructure meant disease spread rapidly. Without food deliveries, people starved. Without clean water, they died of thirst or contamination. Without law enforcement, order broke down completely. Gangs and warlords took control of neighborhoods and imposed their own brutal forms of governance. Violence became routine. Survival became everything. The lucky ones managed to escape to rural areas where food might still be grown and water might still be clean. But those areas filled up quickly and couldn't support unlimited refugees. Rural communities turned away city dwellers, or worse, those who persisted in trying to enter were met with lethal force. The environmental spiral. While humanity tore itself apart fighting over dwindling resources, the environment was accelerating its own collapse in ways that would have been catastrophic even without the social breakdown. The loss of industrial civilization meant that many of the engineering projects holding back natural disasters were no longer maintained. Seawalls failed and coastal regions flooded. Dams burst and river valleys were scoured clean. Levees broke and agricultural zones turned into swamps. Nuclear power plants without proper management went into meltdown, releasing radiation that made vast areas uninhabitable. Chemical factories exploded or leaked their contents into soil and water. Oil refineries burned uncontrolled for months, sending toxic smoke across continents. The environmental damage from the collapse dwarfed anything that had come before. Worse still, the feedback loops that climate scientists had warned about for decades kicked into overdrive. The Arctic permafrost, no longer frozen, released gigatons of methane into the atmosphere. This accelerated warming, which melted more permafrost, which released more methane in a cycle that fed itself. Ocean currents that had regulated global climate for millennia began to shift as temperature and salinity changed. This disrupted weather patterns worldwide, bringing droughts to regions that had been wet and floods to regions that had been dry. Agricultural zones that had supported human populations for thousands of years became unusable. The forests that had survived deforestation were now dying from heat stress, pest infestations, and fire. When a forest dies, it releases its stored carbon back into the atmosphere, further accelerating warming. The Amazon, the Congo, the boreal forests of Russia and Canada, all of them were burning or dying, turning from carbon sinks into carbon sources. The ocean was warming and acidifying, killing coral reefs and disrupting marine food chains. Fish, populations that had fed billions, collapsed as their habitats changed too rapidly for them to adapt. The ocean's ability to absorb carbon dioxide was diminishing, meaning more greenhouse gases stayed in the atmosphere. Weather events became more extreme. Hurricanes that would have been once-in-a-century storms occurred every year. Tornadoes swept across regions that had never seen them before. Heat waves and cold snaps shattered all previous records. Predicting weather became nearly impossible, as old models no longer applied. Farmers who had known when to plant based on generations of experience found that knowledge useless as seasons shifted and traditional patterns vanished. Biodiversity collapsed as species after species went extinct. The intricate web of life that had supported humanity was unraveling, and there was no way to stop it. Each species lost made the remaining ecosystem more fragile, more vulnerable to the next shock. We were witnessing a mass extinction event comparable to the one that killed the dinosaurs, except this time it was happening over decades instead of millennia. and we were both the cause and the primary victims. Attempts at survival. Not everyone gave up or turned to violence. Throughout the chaos, people tried to build something, to maintain civilization in whatever form they could manage. Communities formed around shared resources and mutual protection. Towns and neighborhoods organized themselves, establishing rules, sharing food, defending their territory. These efforts were genuine and often heroic. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things to keep their families and neighbors alive. Some succeeded in creating stable enclaves, little islands of order in a sea of chaos, but most eventually failed because they couldn't solve the fundamental problem of resources. You might have safe walls and armed guards, but if you don't have food or water, your community dies. Trade networks emerged where people could exchange goods, medical supplies for fuel, food for weapons, labor for shelter. These networks were dangerous and unreliable, but they were often the only way to get what you needed. Caravans traveled between communities, carrying goods and news, risking ambush and worse because the alternative was stagnation and death. Some of these traders became wealthy by the standards of the post-collapse world, though wealth now meant having enough to eat and a secure place to sleep. Technology became simultaneously more valuable and less available. A working solar panel or a water purification device could mean the difference between life and death for a community. People who knew how to repair electronics or maintain engines were prized and protected. Knowledge itself became a resource to be hoarded or shared depending on the circumstances. Libraries were raided not for books to read, but for technical manuals and agricultural guides, information that had practical application. The Exodus fleet remained in orbit through all of this, and occasionally their ships would descend to retrieve personnel or resources they'd left behind. These landings were military operations, fast insertions with armed escorts, because the ground was hostile territory. People would attack Exodus ships on principle, knowing they represented everything that had gone wrong, the selfishness and abandonment that had doomed Earth. Some attacks succeeded, which led the Exodus to stop landing entirely. They had what they needed, a self-sufficient fleet with the capacity to travel between solar systems. Earth could burn for all they cared, and burn it did. The psychological impact of watching those ships depart, knowing they were leaving forever, knowing they were abandoning billions to die, that trauma would persist for generations in the survivors. Religious movements emerged, some apocalyptic, and others seeking to find meaning in the collapse. Prophets appeared claiming to have answers, salvation through faith or redemption through suffering. These movements gathered followers desperate for hope or explanation, and some became powerful forces in regional politics. Others turned violent, launching crusades against non-believers or sacrificing people to appease angry gods. The collapse didn't just destroy physical infrastructure, it shattered psychological infrastructure too, the shared narratives and beliefs that held societies together. People needed new stories to make sense of their world, and they created them from whatever materials were at hand. The long decline. The years between 2160 and 2180 were characterized by what historians now call the long decline. Though survivors called it many things, most of them unprintable. This wasn't a sudden catastrophe, but a grinding, relentless deterioration of everything. Population declined steadily through starvation, disease, violence, and simple despair. Birth rates plummeted as people couldn't or wouldn't bring children into such a world. Those children who were born often didn't survive their first years. Life expectancy dropped from the 80s back to what it had been in the 19th century, and in many places lower than that. Communities that had survived the initial collapse began failing as their resources ran out, or their leadership died without replacement. Knowledge was lost as the people who possessed it died without passing it on. Entire technologies became incomprehensible, as the industrial base needed to produce them vanished. You might have a device that purifies water, but when it breaks, and there's nobody who knows how to fix it, and no parts to replace what's broken, it becomes worthless. This loss of technological capacity was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the decline because it was irreversible. Humanity had spent thousands of years building up its technological knowledge base, and in a few decades, most of it became inaccessible. Language began to fragment as communities lost contact with each other. Regional dialects diverged into mutually incomprehensible languages within a generation. Written language became rare as literacy rates dropped. Why learn to read when books are scarce and practical skills matter more for survival? The great libraries of knowledge that humanity had built were burned for warmth or left to rot, their contents lost forever. Culture fractured along with language. Shared history and shared identity dissolved as communities focused purely on survival. National identities that had persisted for centuries became meaningless. Who cares what nation you belong to when there's no nation left, when borders are purely theoretical and governments are distant memories? New identities formed based on locality and immediate circumstance, but these were tribal and exclusive, defining themselves as much by who they opposed as who they included. The environment continued its deterioration throughout this period, but the pace changed. Without industrial emissions, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels began to stabilize, though they remained far above pre-industrial levels. The oceans continued warming due to lag effects, but the rate of warming slowed. Nature began reclaiming abandoned cities, vegetation growing over concrete, animals returning to areas where humans no longer dominated. This recovery was uneven and incomplete. The damage done couldn't be reversed in any human time frame, but it was something. Some communities noticed and began working with nature rather than against it, relearning agricultural techniques that didn't require industrial inputs, managing forests rather than clear-cutting them, fishing sustainably because they couldn't afford to deplete stocks. These practices spread slowly. Knowledge passed from community to community by traders and travelers. The world was healing, but it would never be the same world that existed before the collapse. By 2170, the global population had stabilized at somewhere around 2 billion people, down from 15 billion at peak. This wasn't equilibrium, it was exhaustion. The die-off had simply run its course through the most vulnerable populations. The survivors were those who had access to resources, who lived in regions that could still support human life, who had the skills and knowledge to adapt. They weren't necessarily the best or the most deserving. Survival rarely works that way, but they were what remained of humanity. Cities, as we understand them, ceased to exist. The massive metropolises that had housed tens of millions were now ruins, picked over by scavengers and avoided by the cautious due to contamination and instability. Small towns and villages became the basic unit of human settlement, each one basically autonomous and suspicious of outsiders. Trade existed, but was limited to essentials, and luxuries were forgotten concepts. People wore clothes until they fell apart, and then made new ones from whatever materials they could find. They ate what they could grow or hunt or gather. They lived in structures. They built themselves from salvaged materials. Life was hard and short and dangerous, but it was life. The first signs. Everything changed in 2175, when observers in several widely separated locations reported seeing lights in the sky. Not satellites or the Exodus fleet, those were known quantities, but new lights moving in patterns that suggested intelligent control. Reports were dismissed as misidentifications or hallucinations. People saw what they wanted to see, and the sky was full of debris from the old world, but the sightings continued and became more detailed. Objects were descending through the atmosphere, slowing before impact, metallic spheres or cylinders that crashed into remote areas. Expeditions sent to investigate found craters and burn marks, but nothing else. Whatever had come down was gone by the time anyone arrived to look. Then came the first confirmed encounter in what used to be called the American Midwest. A small farming community reported that something had landed in their fields during the night. They approached cautiously in the morning and found a machine, crude-looking but clearly manufactured, about the size of a car and covered in sensors and manipulators. It didn't do anything threatening at first, just sat there making clicking noises and occasionally extending an arm to pick up dirt or rocks. People watched it for hours, debating what to do, and then it started moving toward their homes. That's when they shot at it. Bullets bounced off its armor. The machine didn't seem to notice or care. It continued its approach and people ran. The machine proceeded to systematically dismantle the community's water pump, taking it apart piece by piece and loading the components into compartments that opened in its body. Then it moved to the solar panels and did the same thing. By the time it finished, it had stripped the community of every piece of advanced technology they possessed. Then it walked away into the forest and disappeared. More incidents followed in quick succession across different continents. Machines appearing, taking things, sometimes peacefully and sometimes violently if people resisted. They varied in size and design, but shared common features: metallic construction, obvious sensors, manipulator arms, and a complete disregard for human life. When people attacked them, they defended themselves with weapons that ranged from simple blunt force to energy beams that could cut through stone. Dozens died in these early encounters before communities learned to avoid the machines, or at least not to provoke them. Scientists and engineers who examined wreckage from destroyed machines found technology that was advanced, but not impossibly so. Efficient power sources, sophisticated sensors, durable materials, but nothing that violated known physical laws. These machines could have been built by humans if humans still had the industrial capacity. That realization led to the first theories about their origin. Maybe they were from the Exodus, maybe this was how the space colonists had decided to harvest resources from Earth. It made a certain horrible sense. They'd abandoned the planet, but now they needed raw materials, and there were convenient primitives down here who couldn't effectively resist. Other theories suggested they were autonomous systems left behind from before the collapse, mining robots or terraforming equipment that had been activated by some triggering condition and were now following their programming without regard for the changed circumstances. A few people proposed they were alien, visitors from another world who saw Earth as abandoned and ripe for exploitation. Each theory had evidence supporting it and evidence against it, and without the technological infrastructure to properly study the machines, determining the truth was nearly impossible. What was immediately obvious was that these machines represented a new threat category entirely. They were organized, they were purposeful, and they were apparently endless. Every time one was destroyed or driven off, more appeared. They didn't negotiate, they didn't communicate beyond simple threat displays, and they didn't stop. Communities that had survived the collapse through cooperation and adaptation now faced an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with or fought with the limited resources available. People began calling them ARTs, a term that supposedly came from the arc-shaped radar signature they produced. Though early on there were no functioning radars to detect such things, the name stuck regardless, short and ominous, and easy to remember. The ARCs were here, they were hostile, and nobody knew how to stop them. The First Wave. What became known as the First Wave began in earnest in 2176 and continued for the next decade. ARCs appeared in larger numbers and in coordinated groups. They weren't randomly wandering anymore, but seemed to be executing a deliberate campaign. Patterns emerged from survivor reports. The machines targeted infrastructure first: power generation, water systems, communication arrays. Then they went after settlements, not to kill necessarily, though casualties were common, but to strip resources and dismantle structures. Communities that resisted were destroyed. Those that fled were pursued and scattered. The machines didn't occupy territory. They didn't build their own structures or settle in place. They simply took what they wanted and moved on. This made fighting them nearly impossible with conventional tactics. You couldn't hold a defensive line because they weren't trying to capture ground. You couldn't cut their supply lines because they appeared to be self-sufficient. Ambushes and guerrilla tactics had limited effectiveness because the machines learned quickly, adapting their behaviors to counter whatever strategies humans employed. Armor that had been vulnerable to a particular weapon would be reinforced. Sensors that had been fooled by a specific technique would be upgraded. The ARCs were improving themselves in real time based on combat experience. Some communities tried negotiation despite the apparent futility. They left offerings or messages hoping to communicate peaceful intent or trade goods for safety. The machines ignored all of it. They weren't interested in what humans could offer because they could simply take whatever they needed. The only communication the ARCs seemed to understand was force, and humanity had precious little of that to deploy. Weapons from the old world still existed, military equipment abandoned during the collapse, but using it required ammunition and power sources that were increasingly scarce. A community might have a working tank or an artillery piece, but once they fired their limited supply of shells, it became a worthless hunk of metal. The machines, on the other hand, never seemed to run out of resources. Resistance groups formed specifically to fight the ARCs, drawing members from across multiple communities. These groups operated as mobile strike forces, attacking machines when they could, warning settlements of approaching threats, and trying to gather intelligence on ARC capabilities and weaknesses. They had some successes, destroying isolated machines or driving off small groups, but they were ultimately fighting a losing battle. For every ARC they destroyed, 5 more appeared. The machines could afford losses, humans couldn't. The psychological impact of the first wave was devastating. People had survived the collapse through resilience and hope, believing that if they could just hold on long enough, things would get better. The ARCs destroyed that hope because they represented a threat that could never be negotiated with, never be defeated, never give up. How do you maintain morale when the enemy is literally tireless and apparently unlimited? Communities began abandoning the surface entirely, moving into bunkers, caves, old mines, anywhere that offered protection from above. This solved the immediate problem of ARC attacks but created new problems of sustainability. Underground settlements required resources from the surface, food and water, and materials for maintenance. Raiding parties had to venture up periodically, risking encounters with machines to gather what they needed. These expeditions became the lifeline of underground communities and the focus of their military capability. The best fighters, the most skilled scavengers, these were the people who went topside and tried to return before the ARCs found them. They called themselves different things in different places, but the role was universal. Surface scouts, scavengers, raiders. They were the brave or the desperate, often both, and they had the highest casualty rates of any role in the post-collapse world. But they were also necessary. Without them, the underground communities would wither and die. The first wave changed the fundamental nature of human existence. Before, survival had been a matter of managing resources and avoiding human threats. Now it required avoiding or fighting machines that were specifically hunting for human activity. Smoke from fires could draw ARCs, noise from machinery, electromagnetic emissions from any functioning technology. People learned to live quietly, to hide their presence, to move carefully. The world above became a hostile place that belonged to the machines. Humans were just visitors, trying not to be noticed. The underground cities. As surface life became untenable, survivors focused on expanding underground settlements into something sustainable. Natural cave systems were expanded through backbreaking excavation. Old subway tunnels were connected and refurbished. Basements of collapsed buildings were reinforced and deepened. The goal was to create communities that could survive entirely without surface contact, though that was never fully achieved. These underground cities, and that's not too grand a term for the larger ones, required extraordinary engineering to function. Air circulation was critical because underground spaces quickly become toxic without proper ventilation. People dug air shafts to the surface, disguising their outlets to avoid attracting ARC attention. Water was another constant challenge. Underground aquifers could be tapped, but required pumps that needed power. Some communities relied on hand pumps, turning what had been automatic into hard labour. Food production underground is nearly impossible without artificial light, which requires significant power. Some communities built hydroponic farms using LED arrays powered by carefully rationed electricity from salvaged solar panels and batteries. Others relied entirely on surface raids to bring back food stores. Hunting and gathering became critical skills again, knowledge passed down from elders who remembered life before the collapse. Power generation was the bottleneck limiting everything else. Solar panels could only be placed on the surface in locations the ARCs didn't frequent, and even then they risked being discovered and destroyed. Wind turbines were similarly vulnerable. Some communities got creative, using bicycle generators and human labour to produce small amounts of electricity, enough to power essential systems, if not much else. Geothermal power was available in some locations, but required drilling equipment that few communities possessed. The engineering and organisational challenges of underground life led to the development of new social structures. Leaders emerged based on competence rather than inheritance or election. The people who kept the lights on and the water flowing had authority because everyone's survival depended on them. These societies were necessarily authoritarian in some ways. Resources were too scarce to tolerate waste or dissent. Rules were strict, and enforcement was harsh because the margin for error was non-existent. But they were also surprisingly egalitarian in others. Everyone contributed what they could and received what they needed, regardless of their pre-collapse status. The wealthy elite who had survived the collapse found that their money meant nothing underground. They worked alongside everyone else, or they were expelled. Culture adapted to underground existence in unexpected ways. Art and music continued because humans need these things to maintain psychological health. People painted murals on tunnel walls, performed plays in communal spaces, told stories that connected them to their past and to each other. Education became informal but intense. Skills were too valuable to lose. Children were taught everything the community knew about engineering, agriculture, medicine, combat. The goal was to ensure that knowledge survived, even if individuals didn't. Several underground settlements grew large enough to deserve their own names, though communication between them was sporadic and dangerous. The tubes, as the interconnected tunnel systems were called, sometimes linked different communities, allowing for trade and information exchange. Travellers who moved through the tubes became critical figures, bringing news from distant places, carrying messages, and facilitating deals. They were respected and protected by an informal code that crossed community boundaries because everyone understood their value. The largest and most successful of these underground cities was called Toledo, located in what had been the American Rust Belt. Toledo controlled an extensive network of tunnels and had established satellite communities throughout its region. It became a hub for trade and a destination for refugees seeking stability. Within Toledo was a neighbourhood known as Sparanza, which would eventually become the launching point for organised resistance against the ARCs. But that was still to come. The decade of adaptation, 2176 through 86, marked a period where humanity learned to survive in its new circumstances. The ARCs continued their activities on the surface, but the first wave wasn't as intense as it had been initially. Machines still appeared, and still took resources, but the frequency of attacks decreased. This wasn't mercy or cessation of hostilities. The ARCs had simply harvested most of what they wanted from easily accessible locations. They were now focused on processing what they'd gathered and building new facilities on the surface. Observation posts established by brave or foolish surface dwellers reported that ARCs were constructing structures in remote areas. Massive frameworks of metal and composite materials that served unknown purposes. These facilities were heavily guarded by machines that attacked anything approaching them. Several attempts to sabotage or infiltrate them ended in complete failure and heavy casualties. The ARCs were establishing their own infrastructure on Earth, which suggested permanence rather than temporary exploitation. This realization changed strategic thinking in the underground communities. If the machines were here to stay, then humanity needed long-term solutions rather than short-term survival strategies. Plans began forming for a genuine counter-offensive, not just defending what little remained, but actively pushing back against the machine presence. This required resources and organization that no single community possessed, which meant cooperation on a scale that hadn't been seen since before the collapse. Diplomatic missions traveled through the tubes, connecting different underground cities, proposing alliances and shared strategies. These negotiations were difficult because communities had diverse interests and limited trust. Some leaders wanted to continue hiding and avoiding conflict. Others advocated for aggressive action, even if the chances of success were low. Compromises were eventually reached: mutual defense pacts, shared intelligence networks, coordinated raid schedules that prevented communities from competing for the same surface resources. These agreements weren't always honoured, and enforcement was impossible, but they represented a step toward larger organisation. Technology development became a priority wherever resources allowed. Engineers and scientists worked to reverse engineer ARC technology from salvaged parts, hoping to find weaknesses or develop countermeasures. Progress was slow because the machine's construction was sophisticated and often beyond the manufacturing capacity available. But small advances were made: better armour materials, more efficient power sources, weapons that could damage ARC units with fewer shots. These improvements were shared through the informal network of travellers and traders, spreading capabilities across multiple communities. Training programs were established to create specialised fighters who could operate on the surface against ARC opposition. These programs were brutal because the standards were necessarily high. Only the best could survive topside, and failure meant death not just for the individual, but potentially for their entire community if their mission was critical. Graduates of these programs became elite operatives, respected and admired even as they were recognized as having short life expectancies. They developed tactics specifically for fighting ARCs, hit-and-run attacks, exploiting machine blind spots, using the environment for cover and concealment. The ARCs adapted to these tactics, but the cycle of innovation and counter-innovation continued. Medical knowledge advanced in unexpected ways as communities dealt with injuries and illnesses using only the resources available. Antibiotics were priceless commodities, carefully rationed and reserved for the most critical cases. Surgery was performed with salvaged instruments and sterilized through boiling because there were no other options. Traditional medicine and herbal remedies, long dismissed as superstition by the technological civilization that had existed before the collapse, were rediscovered and refined through trial and error. People died from conditions that would have been trivial to treat in the old world, but those who survived contributed to a growing body of practical medical knowledge adapted to post-collapse circumstances. Agriculture underwent similar evolution, with surface farming being impossible due to ARC activity. All food production either happened underground or through carefully hidden surface gardens that could be abandoned instantly if machines approached. Crop selection focused on species that grew quickly and provided maximum nutrition with minimum inputs. Fungal cultivation became widespread because fungi thrive in dark underground conditions. Insect farming provided protein, though convincing people to eat bugs required cultural shifts that took years. The decade saw population begin growing again after years of decline, a sign that humanity had successfully adapted to its new circumstances. Children born in this period knew nothing of the old world. For them, underground cities and surface raids and constant ARC threats were simply normal. This generational transition was psychologically significant because it meant humanity's future wasn't entirely defined by its past. These children would grow up to become the raiders and engineers and leaders who would shape the next phase of human history. Rumours and theories. Throughout this period, speculation about the ARC's true origin and purpose remained a constant topic of discussion. Without the scientific infrastructure to properly study them, people relied on observation and theory, developing explanations that ranged from plausible to fantastical. The most persistent theory was that the Exodus was responsible. This made intuitive sense to many survivors. The people who had abandoned Earth would naturally view it as a source of raw materials for their space colonies. They'd sent robotic harvesters to strip mine the planet, not caring about the remnant human population because they'd already written Earth off. Evidence supporting this theory included the timing. ARCs appeared roughly 10 years after the Exodus fleet departed, about right for them to establish themselves in the outer solar system and then send machines back. Also, the technology level of the ARCs was consistent with what the Exodus would have had, advanced but not alien. The counter-argument was that the Exodus had no reason to harvest Earth when asteroid mining would be easier and less likely to provoke resistance. Why come back to a planet full of hostile survivors when raw materials existed throughout the solar system? Also, communication intercepts from Exodus ships before they left monitoring range showed no indication of plans for Earth resource extraction. They seemed genuinely eager to sever all ties with their homeworld, treating it as a closed chapter. The second major theory posited that ARCs were autonomous systems left over from the old world, perhaps a military project gone rogue, or terraforming equipment that had activated according to pre-programmed schedules without human oversight. This would explain their seemingly programmatic behaviour and their focus on resource extraction and facility construction. They were following instructions written before the collapse. The weakness of this theory was that no one remembered any project that matched the ARC's capabilities or design. The world before the collapse had plenty of autonomous systems, but nothing that could self-replicate or adapt as quickly as the ARCs apparently could. A third theory, less popular but persistently argued by some factions, was extraterrestrial origin. The ARCs came from beyond Earth, sent by an alien civilization that had detected the collapse and saw an opportunity to claim the planet. Humanity was barely clinging to survival. We weren't in a position to resist a determined alien invasion, especially if that invasion took the form of autonomous machines rather than living beings. The proponents of this theory pointed to the arc-shaped radar signatures as being unlike any human technology and suggested that the machine's disinterest in communication indicated a fundamental incompatibility between human and alien cognition. Critics noted that alien invasion was the least parsimonious explanation, introducing unnecessary entities when terrestrial origins were perfectly plausible. The alien theory also failed to explain why a spacefaring civilization would bother with Earth when the galaxy presumably offered countless worlds easier to exploit. Regardless of which theory was correct, the practical implications were the same. Humanity faced an adversary it didn't fully understand and couldn't effectively resist. Knowing whether the ARCs came from the Exodus or from Alpha Centauri wouldn't change the fact that they were here and needed to be dealt with. Still, people debated these questions endlessly because humans need to understand their circumstances. We need narratives that explain why things are happening to us. The uncertainty about ARC origins created anxiety that manifested in various ways. Some communities developed fatalistic attitudes, believing resistance was pointless against such a superior enemy. Others became fanatically devoted to fighting the machines, treating the struggle as a holy war that defined human purpose. Religious movements incorporated the ARCs into their cosmologies, interpreting them as demons or angels, or judgment or test depending on the particular theology. These interpretations influenced behaviour. Communities led by religious leaders who viewed ARCs as demons tended to fight aggressively, while those who saw them as divine judgment often advocated for submission and acceptance. The storm warning. In 2185, surface observers began reporting troubling new developments. The ARC facilities that had been constructed over the previous decade were becoming more active. Energy signatures increased, construction accelerated, and new machines appeared that were larger and more heavily armed than anything seen in the first wave. The underground cities shared this intelligence through their networks, and the conclusion was unanimous. Something big was coming. The ARCs had been building up to a second offensive, and when it came, it would make the first wave look like a preliminary skirmish. Communities began preparing for the worst, stockpiling resources, reinforcing defences, training additional fighters. Evacuation plans were drafted for settlements deemed too vulnerable to defend. The tubes saw increased traffic as people relocated to deeper or more remote locations. There was discussion of sealing some tunnel entrances permanently to prevent ARC penetration into the underground networks. But this was rejected as too risky because surface access was still necessary for resource gathering. Some leaders proposed attempting direct contact with the ARCs before the new wave began, one last effort to establish communication and possibly prevent further conflict. A diplomatic mission was organised. Volunteers who would approach an ARC facility under flag of truce and attempt to initiate dialogue. The mission was controversial because many believed it would accomplish nothing except getting brave people killed, but the attempt was made regardless. The mission never returned. Whether they were killed, captured, or simply got lost, no one ever determined. Their fate became another mystery in the growing collection of unknowns surrounding the ARCs. The expected offensive began in 2186 with shocking intensity. This second wave was coordinated across the entire planet, suggesting a level of organisation and planning that the machines hadn't previously displayed. New ARC variants appeared, some specialised for underground warfare with drilling capabilities and sensors that could penetrate deep into the earth. Others were clearly designed for air operations, flying machines that could cover vast distances and attack from above. The largest were mobile factories that could process raw materials and produce new machines in the field, creating a self-sustaining invasion force. Surface settlements that had managed to survive the first wave were systematically destroyed in the opening days of the second wave. Underground cities came under direct assault as ARCs breached tunnels and engaged defenders in close-quarters combat. The fighting was desperate and brutal, humans using every weapon and tactic they could devise against an enemy that kept coming regardless of losses. Some communities held, others were overrun, and their populations forced to flee deeper into the tubes or attempt surface escape into regions where ARC concentration was lower. The casualty rates in the first months of the second wave exceeded those of the entire first wave. Humanity was being pushed to the brink of extinction again, and this time there was nowhere left to retreat to. The surface belonged to the machines, and now they were taking the underground too. Something had to change or humanity would be reduced to scattered bands of survivors hiding in the most remote corners of the planet. and eventually even those would be hunted down and eliminated. The formation of the Raiders. Desperation breeds innovation, and in 2186, the surviving underground cities began organizing themselves in unprecedented ways. The loose alliances of the previous decade were formalized into something resembling a coordinated resistance. Leaders from major settlements met in a conference held deep in the tubes, far from any ARC presence, to discuss strategy and resource allocation. From this meeting emerged the concept of the Raiders, not as the informal scavengers who'd existed before, but as a professional force dedicated to surface operations and ARC combat. The Raiders would be drawn from all communities, but operate as a unified organization with shared training, equipment, and command structure. Their mission was threefold: gather resources necessary for underground survival, gather intelligence on ARC capabilities and weaknesses, and conduct offensive operations to disrupt ARC activities wherever possible. Volunteers were recruited from across the underground networks, and the response was overwhelming. Thousands of people, many of them young adults who'd grown up knowing only the post-collapse world, stepped forward to join. They understood the risks. The life expectancy of a raider was measured in months, not years, but they also understood the necessity. If the machines weren't fought, if humanity simply hid and waited, extinction was inevitable. The training program developed for the Raiders was comprehensive and brutal. Physical conditioning to handle the demands of surface operations, weapons training with every available type of armament, tactics for engaging ARCs individually and in groups, survival skills for operating in hostile territory, and psychological preparation for the trauma of combat and the loss of comrades. Instructors were veterans of the first wave who'd survived through skill and luck, and they held nothing back. Trainees who couldn't meet standards were washed out, not as punishment, but because sending unprepared people topside was murder. Equipment was standardized where possible, with manufacturing capacity focused on producing reliable gear rather than attempting innovation. Raiders were equipped with layered armor made from salvaged materials and ARC components, weapons that balanced stopping power against ammunition availability, communication devices for coordinating operations, and packs configured for rapid resource collection. Every piece of equipment was tested extensively because failure topside meant death. The Raider organization established bases in multiple locations, heavily fortified positions in the tubes that served as staging areas for surface operations. These bases became communities unto themselves, with their own culture and traditions developing rapidly. Raiders formed tight bonds with their squad mates because those were the people you trusted with your life during operations. Rituals emerged around mission launches and returns, ways of honoring those who didn't come back and celebrating those who did. Command structure was deliberately flat, with experienced raiders having authority based on proven competence rather than rank. This meritocratic approach worked because the nature of surface operations didn't allow for distant leadership making decisions without ground truth. Squad leaders needed autonomy to respond to changing circumstances, and higher command needed to trust their judgment. Operations were planned carefully, using intelligence gathered from previous missions, mapping ARC patrol patterns, identifying resource caches, determining optimal extraction routes. But plans rarely survived contact with the enemy, and raiders learned to adapt quickly or die. Success stories from early raider operations boosted morale throughout the underground communities. When a squad returned with critical supplies or intelligence about a new ARC weakness, it demonstrated that resistance was possible, that humanity wasn't helpless against the machines. These victories were small and costly, but they mattered psychologically as much as practically. The battle for the Rust Belt. The region that would become known as the Rust Belt was the site of the most intensive fighting during the late 2180s. This area had been an industrial heartland before the collapse, filled with factories and mines and infrastructure. The ARCs had targeted it heavily during both waves because of the concentrated resources, but human survivors had also gathered there because of the extensive underground networks left by previous industrial activity. The result was a conflict zone where neither side could achieve dominance, a perpetual struggle for control of key locations. The Rust Belt became a proving ground for raider tactics and strategy. Every type of terrain existed there: urban ruins, forested areas, wetlands, open plains, and each required different approaches. Raiders learned through trial and error, paying for lessons with casualties. Ambush tactics worked well in ruins where sightlines were limited, but the same tactics failed in open terrain where ARCs could detect threats at distance. Underground infiltration was effective against ARC facilities, but required detailed intelligence and careful timing. Direct assaults rarely succeeded unless the target was lightly defended and could be overwhelmed quickly. One particular battle became legendary in Raider history: the Dam Battlegrounds engagement in 2188. An ARC facility had been constructed near an old hydroelectric dam, and the machines were using it to power their operations and produce new units. A coalition of Raider squads from multiple communities organised a coordinated assault, the largest human offensive since the second wave began. The battle lasted for 3 days, with Raiders attacking in waves against determined ARC defence. Casualties were horrific. Over 60% of the attacking force was killed or wounded, but the facility was destroyed and the dam reclaimed for human use. The victory was Pyrrhic but meaningful. It demonstrated that concentrated human force could overcome ARC positions if the cost was acceptable. The psychological impact of the Dam Battlegrounds victory was immense. It showed that humanity could still win, still fight back effectively. Recruitment for the Raiders increased, and communities committed more resources to supporting their operations. The machines seemed to recognize this shift because their response became more aggressive. New ARC variants appeared designed specifically for anti-personnel operations, fast-moving units that hunted Raiders on the surface. The technological arms race between humans and machines accelerated, with both sides constantly adapting to counter the other's innovations. Throughout this period, the surface was being fundamentally transformed by ARC activity. The machines were terraforming Earth, not to make it habitable for humans, but for their own purposes. Atmospheric composition was being altered by industrial emissions from ARC facilities. Landscapes were being reshaped by massive excavation operations. Entire regions were becoming mechanized zones where human life couldn't exist. This transformation was slow but relentless, and it raised an existential question. Even if humanity survived the conflict, would Earth still be a planet humans could live on? The answer to that question was unclear, but one thing was certain: the world was fundamentally changed and would never return to what it had been before the ARCs arrived. The year 2190 marked a kind of equilibrium point in the conflict. Humanity had been pushed back but had stabilized its position. The underground cities were secure, the Raider forces were effective enough to maintain surface presence, and the ARCs had established their own infrastructure, but weren't advancing further. Both sides had settled into what military historians would call a sustained conflict, neither achieving victory but neither being defeated. This was the state of the world when the events of ARC Raiders would begin, a planet divided between human underground and machine surface, locked in a conflict where survival, rather than victory, was the only realistic goal, where brave or desperate people called Raiders ventured into hostile territory to gather resources and fight enemies, where every day brought new challenges and every return from topside was celebrated because it meant you'd lived another day. This was the world that humanity had been reduced to, the world that remained after everything else had fallen, and this was where our story truly begins. the current state understanding. Where we are now requires looking at the specific conditions in Sparanza and the surrounding Rust Belt, because this is ground zero for the ongoing conflict between humanity and the ARCs. Sparanza is a neighbourhood within the larger underground complex of Toledo, home to roughly 5,000 permanent residents and serving as the main staging area for raider operations in the region. The community is built into converted industrial tunnels that once served factories and transportation systems, now repurposed for human habitation. Living conditions are cramped but organised, with residential areas separated from industrial workshops and communal spaces. Power comes from a combination of sources, salvaged solar arrays on the surface, carefully hidden from ARC detection, geothermal taps that provide steady, if limited, electricity, and human-powered generators for backup. Water is drawn from underground aquifers and treated through filtration systems that require constant maintenance. Food is a combination of underground fungal farms, insect cultivation, and supplies brought back from surface raids. Nobody eats well by pre-collapse standards, but nobody starves either if they contribute to the community. The social structure of Sparanza reflects its military focus. The most respected members are experienced raiders who've survived multiple surface operations, followed by engineers and technicians who keep the infrastructure functioning, then medical personnel, teachers, and others in supporting roles. Leadership is provided by a council of veteran raiders and community elders who make collective decisions about resource allocation and strategic priorities. This system works because everyone understands that survival depends on cooperation. There's no room for purely self-interested behaviour when the margin between life and death is so narrow. Sparanza is connected to other communities through the tube network, allowing for trade and information exchange. Caravans make regular runs between settlements, carrying goods and messages through tunnels that are relatively safe from ARC detection, though not entirely risk-free. Some sections of the tubes are unstable, or flooded, or claimed by hostile groups, making travel dangerous, even underground. The caravans are heavily guarded and follow established routes that have been proven relatively secure. Surface access from Sparanza is provided by several lift shafts that bring raiders topside in strategic locations. These lifts are carefully camouflaged and defended because if ARCs discovered them, they could penetrate directly into the underground complex and slaughter everyone inside. Guards rotate shifts, watching the lift exits through remote cameras, ready to trigger collapse charges that would seal the shafts if compromise seemed imminent. Every raider knows that their missions put not just themselves at risk, but their entire community, which adds psychological weight to already dangerous work. The surface above Sparanza is a war zone, the Rust Belt proper, where human raiders and Ark machines clash constantly. The terrain is a mixture of collapsed industrial structures, overgrown forests reclaiming what was once cleared land, and open areas that offer no cover and are consequently avoided when possible. ARC patrol patterns change regularly as the machines adapt to human activity, which means intelligence goes stale quickly, and missions require real-time adaptation. The weather is unpredictable and often severe. Storms roll through with little warning, bringing lightning and flooding. Heat waves make daytime operations nearly impossible due to thermal exposure. And winter brings cold that can kill as surely as any machine. Raiders learn to use weather as both tool and obstacle, launching operations during storms when ARC sensors are degraded, but also accepting higher environmental casualties. The machines themselves come in varieties that raiders have learned to classify and name. Harvesters are the most common medium-sized units focused on resource extraction rather than combat, but still dangerous if engaged. Hunters are dedicated combat units that actively seek out human activity and pursue targets relentlessly. Constructors are large machines that build and maintain ARC facilities, rarely encountered away from their work sites, but heavily armed when they are. Flyers are the most feared because they can cover vast distances quickly and attack from angles that ground-based defences struggle with. Then there are the Titans, massive machines that appear rarely but dominate any battlefield they enter, requiring coordinated attacks from multiple raider squads to have any chance of bringing down. Each type requires different tactics and different risk assessments when encountered. Raider squads are typically 5 to 7 people, small enough to move quietly but large enough to handle most threats. Composition varies but generally includes specialists in different roles, a squad leader who makes tactical decisions, a heavy weapons operator carrying anti-machine armaments, scouts who move ahead and identify threats, a tech specialist who can hack ARC systems or repair equipment, and riflemen who provide flexible combat capability. Medical training is universal because injuries on the surface are inevitable, and extraction to underground medical facilities isn't always possible. Squads train together extensively to build the trust and coordination necessary for survival, and squad members often form bonds closer than family because they've kept each other alive through situations that would have killed them individually. Daily life in the underground, understanding what life is actually like for people living in places like Sparanza, gives context to why the Raiders exist and what they're fighting for, because it's not an abstract concept of humanity or civilization, but the concrete reality of communities trying to survive. A typical day begins with the lighting systems simulating dawn, gradually brightening to signal morning, even though there's no actual sun underground. People wake in cramped quarters, typically shared rooms with multiple bunks, because private space is a luxury nobody can afford. Morning routines are efficient out of necessity. Water for washing is rationed and recycled. Waste disposal uses composting systems that require everyone's cooperation to function. Breakfast is communal, with people gathering in dining halls to eat whatever the underground farms have produced, supplemented by supplies from recent surface raids. The food is nutritious but monotonous, fungal protein with algae supplements, and occasionally actual vegetables or meat when surface operations bring them back. Children eat first, then the elderly, then working adults, in order of their shift schedules. This hierarchy is accepted because everyone understands that the most vulnerable need priority. After breakfast, people disperse to their assigned roles because everyone works in Sparanza. There are no idle hands when survival depends on everyone's contribution. Engineers head to maintenance shops to repair equipment that's constantly breaking down from overuse and improvised construction. Farmers tend the underground cultivation areas, managing the delicate balance of nutrients and moisture that keeps the fungal crops growing. Teachers gather children in classroom spaces carved from tunnel walls, educating the next generation in practical skills like mathematics for resource calculation, literacy for reading technical manuals, history, so they understand what was lost and what they're fighting to preserve. Medical personnel staff the clinic, treating everything from minor injuries to serious trauma with limited supplies and extensive improvisation. The social spaces in Sparanza are carefully designed despite resource constraints because people need more than just survival. They need community and culture and connection. Common areas exist where people can gather during off hours, talking and playing simple games and sharing stories. Art adorns tunnel walls, murals painted by community members depicting everything from memories of the surface world to abstract expressions of emotion. Music happens regularly, people playing salvaged instruments or singing together because music costs nothing except time and provides psychological benefits that are measurable in reduced depression and improved morale. These cultural activities aren't luxuries but necessities. Communities that neglect them see higher rates of mental illness and social breakdown. Relationships form and evolve just as they would in any community. People fall in love and form partnerships and have children despite the harsh circumstances, or perhaps because of them. The drive to create life and connection persists, even when logic might suggest otherwise. Marriages are celebrated with whatever ceremony the community can manage. Births are occasions for collective joy. Deaths are mourned by everyone because the community is small enough that everyone knows everyone. The children born underground have never seen open sky or felt natural sunlight. Their entire world is tunnels and artificial light and stories about what the surface used to be like. Educating these children presents unique challenges because they need practical skills for the world they actually live in, not nostalgia for a world that's gone, but they also need to understand history so they know what they're fighting to reclaim or rebuild. Teachers walk a careful line between preparing students for reality and giving them hope for something better. The older generation, people who remember life before the collapse, struggle with what to pass on to those who never knew anything else. Some become bitter and withdrawn, unable to reconcile the world that was with the world that is. Others become passionate teachers and storytellers, determined that knowledge and culture won't die with them. Their memories are valuable, not just emotionally, but practically. They remember technologies and techniques that could be useful if the resources existed to implement them, and occasionally someone recalls something specific that solves a current problem. Mental health is a constant concern in underground communities because living in confined spaces under constant threat takes a toll that accumulates over time. Depression is common, as is anxiety and post-traumatic stress among raiders who've seen combat. The community has developed support systems, both formal counselling when trained personnel are available, and informal peer support networks where people help each other through difficult periods. Suicide happens not frequently, but regularly enough that protocols exist for dealing with it, and the community has learned not to judge those who reach a breaking point because everyone understands how close they might be to that edge themselves. The raider experience. Let's focus specifically on what it's like to be a raider, because these are the people who venture topside and face the ARCs directly. And understanding their experience is key to understanding the broader conflict. Becoming a raider starts with volunteering. Nobody is forced into it, because sending unwilling people on dangerous missions is both cruel and ineffective. The motivations for volunteering vary. Some people feel a genuine calling to protect their community and fight the machines. Others are driven by loss and want revenge for family or friends killed by ARCs. Some are simply restless and find underground life suffocating and would rather die doing something than slowly waste away in tunnels. And a few are seeking glory or recognition, though those motivations rarely survive actual combat. Training takes months and deliberately breaks down volunteers before building them back up into functional operatives. The instructors are harsh because they know that kindness during training leads to deaths during operations. Physical conditioning pushes trainees to their limits and beyond, running through tunnels with heavy packs, climbing vertical shafts, swimming through flooded sections, all while exhausted and stressed. Weapons training covers everything from salvaged firearms to improvised explosives to melee weapons for when ammunition runs out. Tactical instruction teaches squad coordination, how to move as a unit, how to communicate without giving away positions, how to set up ambushes and execute extractions. Survival skills cover everything needed to operate on the surface, navigating by stars and landmarks when electronic devices might attract ARC attention, finding water and shelter, treating injuries, evading pursuit. The psychological component of training is perhaps the most important and the most difficult. Trainees are taught to manage fear, because fear is inevitable, but panic is deadly. They're taught to accept casualties because people will die, and the mission must continue regardless. They're taught to make rapid decisions with incomplete information because hesitation on the surface gets you killed. Many volunteers wash out during training, realizing they're not suited for the role or that they underestimated what it would demand. And this is actually success because it's better to discover limits in training than during actual operations. Those who complete training graduate in ceremonies that are solemn rather than celebratory because everyone knows what comes next. New raiders are assigned to experienced squads where they learn the real lessons that can only be taught through actual experience. How to read terrain for ARC presence, how to distinguish between different machine types by sound alone, how to know when to fight and when to run, how to keep functioning when you're terrified and exhausted and watching your squad mates die around you. The first few operations for a new raider are the most dangerous because inexperience leads to mistakes, and mistakes lead to death. Survival, through those initial missions, is partly skill and partly luck, and those who survive emerge hardened and competent, or broken and useless. A typical raider operation begins with intelligence gathering. Scouts report on ARC activity in the target area. Previous mission data is reviewed. Optimal approach and extraction routes are planned. The squad gathers to receive their briefing. Mission objectives are explained clearly. Everyone knows what they're supposed to accomplish and what the priorities are if things go wrong. Equipment is checked meticulously because a malfunction topside can be fatal. Weapons are cleaned and loaded. Armor is inspected for damage. Communication devices are tested. Supplies are packed. The squad says their goodbyes to loved ones because there's always the possibility they won't return. Some people have rituals they perform before missions, prayers or meditations, or simply quiet moments of reflection. Then they head to the lift and ascend to the surface, emerging into a world that's trying to kill them. The surface is always a shock, even for experienced raiders. The openness after living underground, the natural light if it's daytime, or the darkness if it's night, the weather and wind and smells of the outside world. There's a moment of vulnerability during emergence when the squad is focused on getting clear of the lift and establishing security. And this is when ambushes are most likely if ARCs have detected the exit point. Once clear, the squad moves out toward their objective, using whatever route offers the best combination of speed and concealment. They travel in tactical formation, with scouts ahead and rear security watching for pursuit. Communication is minimal and done through hand signals when possible. Every sense is alert for the sounds or signs that indicate ARC presence. Encountering machines is inevitable during most operations. Sometimes they're distant and can be avoided. Other times, they're directly in the path and must be engaged or bypassed. Occasionally, they detect the squad and initiate combat. Fighting ARCs is terrifying and chaotic. The machines don't experience fear or hesitation. They don't take cover unless tactically optimal. They don't retreat unless programmed to, and they're incredibly difficult to kill. Small arms fire often bounces off their armour, requiring precise shots to joints or sensors to disable them. Heavy weapons can destroy them, but ammunition is limited, and each shot must count. Explosives are effective, but require getting close enough to place them, which puts raiders at risk. The machines adapt during combat. If a tactic works once, they'll counter it the next time. If a weakness is exploited, they'll reinforce it in future designs. Fighting them is like fighting an enemy that learns from every encounter and shares that learning across its entire force. Casualties during operations are common. Someone gets hit by ARC weapons fire and goes down. Someone triggers a trap or sensor and gets swarmed. Someone makes a mistake and dies for it. The squad protocol is clear. If extraction is possible without compromising the mission or other squad members, attempt it. If not, leave them and complete the objective, because the community depends on mission success more than individual survival. This calculus is brutal but necessary, and it creates psychological scars that never fully heal because you're trained to abandon friends to save the mission. When missions succeed and the squad returns with their objectives accomplished, the relief is profound but temporary, because there's always another mission coming. When missions fail, the surviving squad members must report what happened and why, and they must process their guilt and grief while preparing for the next operation, because the work never stops. The technology war. The conflict between humans and ARCs is fundamentally a technological struggle, where one side has overwhelming advantages in manufacturing and resources, while the other has creativity and desperation. Understanding this dynamic explains much about how the war has evolved. Human technology post-collapse is a mixture of salvaged, old-world equipment, reverse-engineered ARC components, and new innovations created from necessity. Weapons range from preserved firearms with carefully hoarded ammunition to crossbows and compound bows that can be manufactured underground using available materials. Explosives are created from salvaged components or chemical processes that use materials gathered topside. Every raider learns basic demolitions because explosives are force multipliers that can compensate for inferior numbers and firepower. Armor is layered protection combining whatever materials are available: salvaged ballistic plates, ARC hull sections reshaped and fitted, improvised ceramic composites, even treated leather and fabric in layers that can stop shrapnel, if not direct hits. The goal is to stop or deflect AOC weapons while remaining mobile, because heavy armor that slows you down is a death sentence on the surface. Communication equipment is carefully managed because electromagnetic emissions can attract ARC attention. Squads use low-power, short-range radios with frequency hopping to avoid detection. They fall back on visual signals when silence is necessary, and they maintain strict radio discipline because a carelessly transmitted message can bring hunters down on your position. Power sources for human equipment are mostly salvaged batteries recharged through solar panels or human-powered generators. Energy is precious and rationed carefully, because running out of power can mean death if you need your equipment to survive. The ARCs have technological advantages in nearly every category. Their armor is sophisticated alloys that resist most human weapons. Their sensors can detect humans at ranges where humans can't detect them. Their weapons fire energy beams or projectiles that can punch through most cover, and they don't need rest or food or morale management. They're also networked in ways humans can only partially understand. When one ARC detects a threat, it shares that information with nearby units instantly. When one is destroyed, its final moments of sensor data are transmitted and analysed to prevent future losses. When new tactics prove effective against them, they propagate counter-tactics across their entire force within days. Fighting them is like fighting an enemy that has perfect communication and collective memory, where every battle makes them slightly better at the next one. Human engineers have made progress in understanding Ark technology through the careful study of destroyed units and salvaged components. They've learned that the machines use modular construction, allowing for rapid repair and modification. They've identified specific power conduits and control nodes that, if damaged, will disable units more effectively than trying to destroy them completely. They've figured out some of the sensor frequencies used, which allows for limited jamming and deception. This knowledge is hard-won and constantly updated as the ARCs adapt, but it gives humans a fighting chance where they wouldn't have one otherwise. One significant development has been the creation of EMP devices, electromagnetic pulse generators built from salvaged electronics that can temporarily disable ARC systems. These devices are expensive in terms of components and energy, but incredibly effective when used correctly. A well-placed EMP can shut down multiple machines simultaneously, creating opportunities for raiders to complete objectives or escape from otherwise impossible situations. The ARCs have responded by hardening their systems against electromagnetic interference, but the arms race continues, with humans finding new frequencies or pulse patterns that work while the machines develop new countermeasures. Hacking ARC systems is theoretically possible and has been accomplished in limited circumstances. Tech specialists have managed to access machine control networks and extract data or even issue false commands that cause confusion among units. These successes are rare because ARC security is sophisticated, and attempts that fail often alert the machines to human presence. But when hacking works, it can provide intelligence that saves lives and enables successful operations. The Holy Grail would be taking control of an ARC unit and turning it against its own kind, but so far this has proved impossible. The machines have safeguards that prevent hostile control and will self-destruct rather than allow capture. Manufacturing capacity is a critical limitation for human technology. Everything must be built underground using improvised tools and limited materials. Workshops in places like Sparanza can produce basic items like ammunition reloading and simple mechanical devices, but complex electronics or precision components are nearly impossible to create, requiring salvage from the surface or trade with other communities. This means that advanced equipment is precious and irreplaceable. When a high-tech weapon or sensor array is lost, it may never be replaced, forcing squads to make do with less capable alternatives. The technology gap between humans and ARCs is actually narrowing slightly, not because humans are advancing, but because they're learning to exploit machine weaknesses more effectively. ARCs are optimized for resource extraction and construction, with combat capability as a secondary function. Humans are now optimized purely for combat against ARCs, which gives them advantages in specific tactical situations, even though strategically the machines remain dominant. The question is whether this narrowing gap can lead to eventual human victory, or if it will just prolong the conflict without changing the ultimate outcome. The resource challenge. Every aspect of human survival in the post-Ark world comes down to resources and the desperate struggle to acquire and manage them. Understanding this helps explain why raiders exist and why the conflict continues, despite the odds. Food is the most immediate need and underground. Communities have developed various approaches to meeting it. Fungal farms provide the bulk of calories because fungi can grow in darkness, using organic waste as substrate. Massive cultivation chambers exist in places like Sparanza, where workers tend the crops and harvest them on regular cycles. The fungi are nutritious but taste terrible and have a texture many people never fully adjust to. But hunger is effective motivation to eat what's available. Insect farming supplements fungal protein with crickets and mealworms raised in controlled conditions. Insects are efficient converters of organic matter into protein and reproduce rapidly. But convincing people to eat bugs required cultural shifts and persistent education about nutrition versus squeamishness. Algae cultivation in water tanks provides additional nutrients and can be processed into various food products. None of them particularly appetizing, but all of them functional. Surface raids focus partially on acquiring food that can't be produced underground. Seeds for plants that might be grown in protected surface gardens. Preserved foods from old-world stockpiles that haven't been contaminated or spoiled. Occasionally, fresh meat from hunting when conditions allow. These supplemental foods are luxuries that boost morale and provide nutritional variety that purely underground diets lack. Water is managed through a closed-loop system where every drop is precious. Underground aquifers provide base supply, but extraction requires energy for pumping and treatment. Grey water from washing and cooking is filtered and reused. Human waste is processed through composting systems that eventually return nutrients to fungal farms. Drinking water is rationed and monitored carefully because the margin between adequate supply and crisis is razor thin. Surface raids sometimes target old water treatment facilities or natural springs where water can be collected in portable containers and brought underground. The weight of water makes these missions physically demanding, but the resource is critical enough to justify the effort. Energy might be the ultimate bottleneck for underground survival because everything else depends on it. Without power, the lights go out, the air circulation stops, the water pumps quit, and the community dies. Solar panels on the surface capture energy during daylight and store it in battery banks underground. But these panels are vulnerable to detection and destruction by ARCs, so they must be carefully concealed and frequently relocated. Geothermal taps provide steady power in locations where the geology permits. But drilling and maintaining these systems requires expertise and equipment that not all communities have. Human-powered generators fill gaps, with people taking shifts on bicycle-style devices that produce electricity through physical effort. It's exhausting work but necessary during shortages. Wind turbines are occasionally used on the surface in remote locations where ARC activity is minimal, but like solar panels, they risk detection and are often destroyed, forcing constant replacement and relocation. Fuel for generators would be ideal, but petroleum products are nearly impossible to acquire. The old world stockpiles are exhausted or contaminated, and producing biofuels underground requires resources better used for food production. Energy rationing is strict, with priority going to critical systems like air circulation and water pumping. Lighting is reduced to minimum safe levels. Personal electronics are forbidden except for essential communication. Heating and cooling are minimal, forcing people to adapt to uncomfortable temperatures. Power failures happen regularly, and communities have protocols for managing them. Essential functions are maintained through backup systems, while everything else shuts down until power is restored. Medical supplies are acquired almost entirely through surface raids because manufacturing pharmaceuticals underground is beyond current capacity. Old world stockpiles are sought out and carefully transported back, despite the risk, because antibiotics and painkillers and other medications can mean the difference between recovery and death from injuries or illness. Natural remedies supplement pharmaceutical supplies, with people rediscovering plant-based treatments that work to varying degrees. Willow bark for pain, certain fungi for fighting infection, various herbs for managing symptoms, if not curing diseases. The community's medics are constantly balancing limited supplies against unlimited need, deciding who gets treatment based on likelihood of survival and value to the community. These triage decisions are ethically agonizing, but unavoidable given resource constraints. Building materials for maintaining and expanding underground spaces come from multiple sources. Salvage operations on the surface recover metal, concrete, plastic, and other materials from collapsed structures. Mining within the underground complexes extends living spaces and provides raw stone and earth, and occasionally surface workshops process materials into needed forms before transport underground. Every construction project is carefully planned to minimize resource waste. Because there are no surplus materials, everything salvaged or extracted has multiple potential uses and must be allocated efficiently. Tools and equipment wear out from constant use and harsh conditions requiring repair or replacement. Workshops dedicate significant effort to maintaining the tools that maintain everything else, welding broken metal, reshaping worn parts, improvising replacements when proper parts aren't available. The skill of the craftspeople who do this work determines whether critical equipment keeps functioning or fails at inopportune moments. Raw materials for manufacturing are increasingly difficult to acquire because the easily accessible surface deposits have been stripped by either ARCs or human raiders. Getting what's needed now requires going into more dangerous areas or conducting more complex operations to extract materials from difficult locations. This increasing scarcity means that every mission becomes more dangerous and less productive, yielding diminishing returns that threaten long-term sustainability. The story's people tell culture and narrative are critical to human survival, not just in practical terms, but psychologically. The stories people tell themselves about who they are and why they fight determine whether they maintain cohesion and purpose or collapse into despair and fracture. The history of the collapse is taught to every child in underground communities, not as distant academic knowledge, but as living memory passed down from those who experienced it. Elders who remember the world before become living bridges to that past. Their testimonies ensure that knowledge isn't lost and that younger generations understand what was lost and why it matters. These stories serve multiple functions. They preserve cultural continuity across the rupture of the collapse. They explain how humanity ended up in its current circumstances, providing context for the struggle. And they maintain hope by showing that humans built civilization once and could theoretically do so again. Different communities emphasize different aspects of history based on their particular circumstances and values. Some focus on technological achievements and what was possible when resources were abundant. Others emphasize the social and political failures that led to collapse, teaching cautionary lessons about inequality and short-term thinking. Still others concentrate on the survival skills and resilience that allowed some people to endure when systems failed around them. The story of the Exodus is particularly contentious because it represents both technological triumph and moral failure, the wealthy escaping while abandoning billions to die. Some communities teach this as a lesson about betrayal and the callousness of elites, using it to motivate resistance and maintain social cohesion through shared resentment. Others frame it differently, suggesting the Exodus was pragmatic rather than malicious, and that preserving some humans in space was better than total extinction, even if the selection process was unjust. These different framings influence community attitudes. Those taught to resent the Exodus tend toward more aggressive postures and greater willingness to take risks, while those taught a more nuanced view might be more cautious and focused on long-term sustainability rather than immediate revenge. Mythology around the ARCs has developed organically as people try to make sense of the machines and their purpose. Some communities anthropomorphize them as demons or manifestations of human sins being punished. Others maintain more rational frameworks, describing them as tools or weapons created by humans or aliens, and now running without oversight. Religious movements have incorporated the ARCs into various cosmologies. One sect believes the machines are a test sent by God to separate the worthy from the unworthy, and that surviving the trial will lead to salvation. Another views them as harbingers of apocalypse, whose arrival means the old world is completely dead and a new world must be born from the ashes. A third considers them neutral forces of nature that must be understood and adapted to rather than fought against. These varying beliefs influence behavior in concrete ways, affecting whether communities fight Arks aggressively or try to avoid them, whether they see the conflict as temporary or permanent, whether they believe eventual victory is possible or even desirable. Heroes emerge from the ongoing conflict and their stories spread through the community networks, becoming legendary. Particular raiders who accomplished impossible missions or saved communities through extraordinary bravery or skill become figures larger than life, whose exploits are embellished in the telling. These hero stories serve important functions by providing role models for young people and demonstrating that human courage and ingenuity can overcome machine advantages. They also create shared cultural touchstones that unify disparate communities around common narratives. One such hero is called Markov, supposedly a raider from the early days, who single-handedly destroyed a Titan using nothing but salvaged explosives and suicidal courage. Whether this actually happened or is invention doesn't matter, as much as the fact that everyone knows the story and discusses what they would have done in Markov's position. Art created in underground communities reflects the psychological state of humanity under siege. Music tends toward either mournful remembrance of what was lost or defiant celebration of survival against odds. Visual art depicts the struggle against ARCs with images ranging from realistic combat scenes to abstract representations of fear and hope. Literature, when it exists, is mostly oral storytelling passed around communities because materials for writing are scarce and literacy is lower than it once was. The themes that dominate post-collapse culture are unsurprisingly focused on survival, loss, resistance, and hope for eventual recovery or at least stable existence. Love stories remain popular because humans need to believe that connection and joy are possible, even in terrible circumstances. Tales of romance between raiders or relationships formed in underground communities provide emotional relief from the grim reality of daily life. Humor exists too, darker than it once was but still present. People make jokes about fungal food and cramped living conditions and the absurdity of fighting machines with improvised weapons. Laughter is a coping mechanism, and communities that retain the ability to laugh at their situation tend to have better morale than those that become entirely grimly serious. Children's stories, taught in underground schools, walk a balance between preparing them for reality and not traumatizing them with details they're too young to process. Simplified versions of history explain that the world used to be different and that people made mistakes that led to problems. Descriptions of ARCs present them as dangerous but beatable, teaching children that the machines aren't invincible, and moral lessons emphasize cooperation and courage and the importance of contributing to community. These educational narratives shape the next generation's understanding of their world and their place in it. The politics of survival. Within underground communities and between them, political dynamics shape decisions that have life or death consequences. Understanding these power structures explains how resources get allocated and why some strategies are pursued while others are rejected. Leadership in places like Sparanza is theoretically democratic, with councils making collective decisions, but in practice, certain voices carry more weight than others based on expertise and track record. Veteran raiders have authority when discussing surface operations because they know the reality of combat with ARCs. Engineers have influence over infrastructure decisions because they understand what's possible with available resources. Medical personnel advise on health-related policies. This meritocratic system works reasonably well when there's consensus about goals, but conflicts arise when different priorities clash, or when decisions involve trade-offs that harm some community members while benefiting others. Resource allocation is the primary source of political tension. When food is scarce, should it be distributed equally or given priority to workers whose roles are critical to community survival? When medical supplies run low, should treatment be provided based on medical need or on the patient's value to the community? When energy is rationed, which functions get power and which get shut down? These questions have no objectively correct answers, and different communities resolve them differently based on their values and circumstances. More authoritarian communities impose decisions from the top, while more democratic ones debate endlessly until consensus emerges or until circumstances force a choice. Between communities, the politics becomes more complex because there's no overarching authority to enforce agreements or resolve disputes. The tube networks connect settlements, but don't unify them into a single political entity. Trade relationships are maintained through mutual self-interest, with communities exchanging what they have surplus for what they lack. But these exchanges can be fraught with tension over fair value and whether partners are honouring agreements. Disputes arise over territory, when multiple communities claim access to the same surface resources, or when population pressure causes one settlement to expand into areas another considers theirs. Military cooperation against ARCs requires coordination, but communities disagree about strategy. Some advocate aggressive offensive operations to disrupt machine activities, while others prefer defensive postures focused on protecting underground spaces. Some want to risk everything on major assaults against ARC facilities, while others believe such efforts waste lives without achieving meaningful goals. These strategic disagreements reflect different risk tolerances and different assessments of whether eventual victory over the ARCs is possible, or whether survival in present form is the best achievable outcome. Trust between communities varies widely based on history and interaction. Settlements that have cooperated successfully on joint operations or supported each other during crises develop strong relationships and alliances, while those that have experienced betrayals or exploitation remain suspicious and engage minimally. Some communities are isolated by choice or geography and have limited contact with others, developing unique cultures and approaches that diverge from broader human norms. Within the Raider organization specifically, there are tensions between different operational philosophies. Some Raiders believe the mission is purely about supporting their home communities through resource acquisition and defending them from ARC attacks, while others see themselves as part of a larger war effort working toward eventual human victory and the reclamation of the surface. These different perspectives influence tactical decisions and affect relationships between squad members. Some Raiders are cautious and mission-focused, minimizing risk and prioritizing survival. Others are aggressive and willing to take chances to inflict maximum damage on ARCs, even if it endangers themselves and their squads. Command tries to balance these tendencies by matching personnel to appropriate missions and maintaining discipline, but the decentralized nature of Raider operations means individual squad leaders have significant autonomy. Factional conflicts occasionally erupt into open disputes or even violence, though this is rare because everyone understands that internal conflict is suicidal when external enemies are so dangerous. More commonly, tensions manifest as passive resistance to directives or informal power struggles, where different leaders attempt to sway opinion and gather supporters for their preferred approaches. The question of long-term goals drives many political debates. Should humanity focus purely on survival in the underground, accepting that the surface belongs to ARCs now? Or should resources be devoted to developing capabilities for eventual reconquest of the planet? Should communities try to make contact with the Exodus and request aid or return of some colonists with advanced technology? Or should they consider the departed as traitors unworthy of forgiveness? Should efforts be made to negotiate with ARCs if communication ever becomes possible? Or should the conflict be treated as existential, requiring total human commitment to defeating the machines? These questions don't have clear answers, and different factions advocate for different approaches. The outcomes of these political debates determine the allocation of scarce resources and shape the future trajectory of human civilization, or what remains of it. The future at stake. Looking forward from 2190, humanity's future is deeply uncertain, with scenarios ranging from gradual extinction to eventual recovery, depending on factors that are difficult to predict. Understanding these possibilities helps clarify what's actually being fought for. The pessimistic scenario sees continued attrition, with human population declining steadily as underground resources run out and surface access becomes more restricted by expanding ARC control. In this future, communities fail one by one as their life support systems break down, or as they're penetrated by machine offensives. Survivors flee to increasingly remote and marginal locations, but eventually there's nowhere left to go. The last humans might survive for another generation or two in the deepest bunkers or most inaccessible locations, but without the ability to reproduce sustainably and maintain technological knowledge, the end is inevitable. Extinction could come quickly through systematic ARC extermination if the machines decide humans are worth the effort to eliminate completely, or slowly through failure of underground ecology and inability to replace degrading infrastructure. Either way, this scenario has Earth eventually becoming a purely machine planet, with humans existing only in whatever form the exodus takes in distant star systems. The moderate scenario involves stabilization at current population and technological levels, with humanity surviving indefinitely in underground communities but never reclaiming the surface or rebuilding anything approaching pre-collapse civilization. In this future, ARCs and humans reach an equilibrium where the machines focus on their objectives, whatever those are, and humans avoid them while extracting enough resources to maintain basic survival. Generations pass with people living their entire lives underground, with surface raids becoming less frequent as communities become more self-sufficient through improved underground agriculture and closed-loop recycling. Culture and knowledge degrade slowly, but humanity persists as a species, even if in diminished form. This is a stable but unsatisfying future, avoiding extinction but also abandoning any hope of recovery or progress. The optimistic scenario imagines eventual human victory over the ARCs through some combination of technological breakthrough, discovery of critical machine weakness, or assistance from unexpected sources like the Exodus returning or other human survivors emerging from unknown locations. In this future, humans develop weapons or strategies that turn the tide, allowing systematic destruction of ARC forces and reclamation of surface territory. Communities emerge from underground and begin rebuilding, salvaging technology and knowledge to restart civilization on more sustainable foundations, learning from the mistakes that led to collapse and creating something better. Earth slowly heals from environmental damage and becomes habitable again. Population grows and spreads. Eventually, humans might even achieve spaceflight again and rejoin or confront the Exodus. This scenario requires almost everything going right and numerous obstacles being overcome. But it's theoretically possible and worth fighting for, according to those who believe in it. Between these extremes are variations involving partial success or failure. Humans might reclaim some surface territory while leaving other areas to machines creating a divided planet. Or technological advancement might allow construction of surface-level protected zones where humans can live without underground confinement but without fully defeating ARCs. Hybrid societies might develop with some communities choosing pure survival underground, while others take risks pushing for reconquest. Different regions might experience different outcomes, with humanity surviving in some locations while going extinct in others, leading to fragmented pocket civilizations rather than global unity. The wild card in any future scenario is whether the ARCs might change their behavior or objectives. If the machines are following programming, they might complete their tasks and become inactive, or even leave Earth. If they're controlled by external intelligence like the Exodus or aliens, that controller might lose interest or capability to direct them. If they're self-improving AI, they might evolve beyond their original parameters in unpredictable ways. Understanding RC motivations would allow humans to plan more effectively, but that understanding remains elusive despite years of observation and study. Another wild card is the potential for human technological breakthrough, a discovery or invention that dramatically shifts the balance of power. This could come from unexpected sources, like a particularly brilliant engineer finding a new approach to energy generation or weapons design, or from lucky salvage of old-world technology that provides capabilities current humans lack, or from systematic research programs if communities ever achieve enough stability to dedicate resources to long-term projects rather than immediate survival. The breakthrough could be military, like a weapon that reliably kills ARCs, or a stealth technology that makes detection impossible. Or it could be infrastructure, like power generation, that doesn't require surface exposure, eliminating a major vulnerability, or communication, enabling coordination between all human communities worldwide, rather than just local networks. Whatever form it takes, a technological breakthrough could change everything, assuming humans can develop and deploy it before ARCs adapt countermeasures. The role of human choice in determining the future shouldn't be understated. Collective decisions about resource allocation, strategic priorities, social organization, and cultural values shape outcomes in ways that are difficult to quantify but undeniably important. Communities that maintain hope and cohesion and willingness to sacrifice for long-term goals have better prospects than those that fragment or become purely self-interested. Individuals who step up and take risks, whether as raiders fighting machines, or engineers innovating solutions, or leaders making difficult decisions, can change the trajectory of their communities and, by extension, humanity's future. The story of post-collapse Earth is still being written by the actions of survivors, and while the odds are daunting and the resources scarce and the enemy relentless, humans retain agency and the possibility of influencing outcomes. What comes next? This brings us to the present moment in 2190, the specific time when the events of Ark Raiders are about to begin. Understanding everything that's come before provides the essential context for understanding what happens next. The communities are stable but strained. Resource challenges continue forcing difficult decisions. The Raider organization is functional, but always one bad operation away from losing critical personnel. The ARCs maintain control of the surface and show no signs of leaving or negotiating. Into this situation come the individuals whose actions will determine what happens next. The Raiders, who will push deeper into ARC territory than anyone has gone before. The engineers who will develop new technologies from salvaged machines. The leaders who will make strategic choices that risk everything on uncertain prospects. The ordinary people who will support these efforts or resist them based on their own assessments of risk and benefit. The story that's about to unfold involves specific missions into heavily defended ARC facilities, seeking intelligence about machine origins and capabilities, the discovery of information that changes human understanding of why the ARCs are here and what they're trying to accomplish, conflicts within human communities about how to use this information and whether to pursue aggressive strategies or maintain current defensive postures, and ultimately decisions that will shape humanity's long-term future for better or worse. The players in this story are diverse, veteran raiders who've survived dozens of operations and know the surface better than anyone else. Rookies fresh from training facing their first real combat. Engineers and scientists trying to make sense of ARC technology from limited samples. Political leaders balancing competing interests and trying to maintain community cohesion. And ordinary civilians whose lives will be affected by decisions made by people they may never meet. Each of these individuals has their own motivations and fears, their own assessment of what matters and what they're willing to sacrifice for it, their own role to play in the larger drama. The locations where events will unfold include familiar places like Sparanza, with its tunnels and workshops and training facilities, other underground settlements, each with unique characteristics and populations. The Rust Belt surface, with its destroyed industrial landscape and constant ARC presence, specific facilities where machines gather and construct and process resources, and possibly locations beyond current human knowledge, where secrets about ARC origins might be hidden. Each location presents unique challenges and opportunities. Familiar terrain gives humans advantages, while unknown areas provide both risks and potential for discovery. The ultimate question that will be answered through these events is whether humanity's current trajectory leads to extinction, stable misery, or possible recovery, and whether individual actions by brave or desperate people can actually change that trajectory, or whether larger forces have already determined the outcome. This question doesn't have a predetermined answer. The future is genuinely uncertain and depends on choices not yet made and events not yet experienced, which means there's still hope, even if it's fragile and contingent on everything going right, when so much has already gone wrong. The raiders who emerge from Sparanza for their next mission don't know they're about to be part of something larger than routine resource acquisition, or ARC harassment. They're focused on immediate objectives and bringing their squad home alive. But circumstances will force them to confront bigger questions and make choices that ripple far beyond their immediate situation. The story of Ark Raiders is ultimately about human persistence in the face of overwhelming adversity, about the bonds between people who face death together, about the moral complexity of survival when every decision has costs and every victory comes with losses, and about whether the spark of human civilization can be preserved and eventually rekindled, or whether it will be extinguished by machines that don't understand or care what they're destroying. This is where we are now, balanced on a knife edge between possible futures, with everything that came before explaining how we got here, and everything that comes next dependent on what happens in the days and weeks ahead. The underground cities hold their breath. The raiders prepare for their next ascent to the surface. The ARCs continue their inscrutable activities, and the world waits to see whether humanity's story ends here or continues into an uncertain future. The choices made now will echo through generations, if there are generations to come. The sacrifices made will be remembered if there's anyone left to remember them. The courage shown will inspire others, if inspiration still matters, in whatever world emerges from this conflict. We stand at the beginning of something that could be the end, or could be a new chapter. Nobody knows which yet, and that uncertainty is both terrifying and oddly hopeful, because it means outcomes aren't predetermined and human action still matters. This is the world that fell. This is the world that fights to rise again. This is the moment before everything changes. This is where the story of Ark Raiders truly begins.